I'm Issam Ahmed. I'm a journalist. I cover health, science, and the environment for in Washington, D.C. for AFP. And with us here is Professor Erum Sattar. So would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today, Erum?
Thank you so much, Issam, for moderating this conversation. And I hope that we have a very rich interaction today. I really want to thank LLF for transitioning to this sort of remote mode and having us on this morning and evening in Pakistan time. What I work on essentially is sort of water law and policy and water governance. And I sort of obsess about the Indus and I think about it sort of, very deeply. So I love how this conversation has been framed, which is that they have sort of framed it as a conception of fault lines. So I'm hoping that those are the kinds of things that we're going to have, a conversation about today and really clarify the scales at which that really matters for Pakistan.
Awesome. So perhaps if we could just set the scene then a little bit. Why are we going to talk about Pakistan and fault lines? Where are we in the where is Pakistan in the hierarchy of water stressed countries at this time? What can we just to give a very kind of just a very zoomed out overview before we start diving into it.
Okay, so I think the key thing to think about is something that is not thought about as well when we think about why is Pakistan a water stressed country. Essentially, there are only, and think about the enormity of this, there are only 16 countries in the world that have more water than Pakistan. So on a total scale, Pakistan has a lot of water, right? It sits at the foothills of what is thought of as a third pole. So the Himalayan Karakoram Hindu Kush mountain range, right, is thought of as a third pole, which means that there's more ice there than at the North Pole and the South Pole, and that's it. So it's thought of as a third pole. So Pakistan sits at the foothill of this great polar sort of ice mass. So we should be very water rich, essentially. Yet, because our denominator is so high, our population figure is so high, therefore we are nearing what is thought of as a per capita threshold scarcity, okay? Which is, 1,000 sort of cubic meters per person per year. Okay, that's sort of the general idea.
Sure.
Now, even that, if you think of, there are plenty of countries that are more water stressed per capita even than Pakistan. Think a lot of the Middle East, right? And yet there doesn't need to be as much, sort of water inequity, and there doesn't need to be as much hunger and poverty as there is in Pakistan, right? So there's no need per se, whatever your water level is, to be water stressed as a result of, or to be economically developed, or to be hungry and poor and malnourished. So those don't go hand in hand. So that's one of the first things that we really need to get out of, right? And the idea becomes that somehow we are getting water stressed, so therefore we need to add infrastructure, right? And somehow those are going to create water. And that's just, none of those are true anymore. So we have a lot of other problems that we need to think of. And I'm happy to think of the transitions to the fault lines.
So yes, absolutely. So thanks for setting that up very nicely and reminding us that this is really a denominator problem. It's not, the supply is actually very vast. So what is going on? We're going to go into this talk and why it's being mismanaged, and actually talk about possible solutions. So the kind of issues that I think a lot of people have become aware of over the years, and what can be done about it. So Erum, would you like to then maybe set up why fault lines? We talked about this earlier, what that phrase means to you in the context of Pakistan and water.
Okay, so that's great. And again, as I said, I think this framing is very helpful for us. So look, Pakistan sits in a very tough neighborhood. And in that tough neighborhood, the idea is that there is this international fault line, okay? And that comes at Pakistan's moment of birth. It's something that we sort of inherit and are bequeathed at partition, okay? So the problem is that Pakistan is essentially a one river system reliant country. The Indus River system is it, okay? India, by contrast, which is basically the upper riparian on all of Pakistan's rivers. I mean, think about that, okay? That's this very serious thing. Essentially the ones that the Indus Waters Treaty of 1960 gives away, right? So India is the upper riparian on these rivers. This is a very serious problem. So there's an international fault line, okay? Plus, Pakistan is also downstream of Afghanistan on the Kabul River. So this is on the western side. So Pakistan is just geographically downstream of where all of the waters are coming from. Location really matters for water control. So therefore, upstream sort of countries, upstream geographies have a lot of ability to, control the water as it flows through their territory. So it's geographical control of water. So one is that. When water actually enters Pakistan, there are massive conflicts at the interprovincial scale. Okay, this is a huge issue. Now, Pakistan had something, and maybe a little later we can go through the example of what the instrument was. An instrument, Interprovincial Water Accord, that was sort of signed in 1991. So we're now in 2020, so this thing is going to be 30 years old next year. Okay, so this is 3 decades. But that, so the fault line, interprovincial, sort of that geographic fault line also is a huge problem. That geographic scale is a massive problem. And then thirdly, when it comes down to the scale of farmers, I mean, the disputes amongst and between farmers are massive. There are very good studies now of where what is called the tail of a canal, so the very end of a canal, right, gets far less regularly than its shares of allotted water. And essentially, those people are very water poor. So theoretically, they have a right, but they have no way of actualizing that right. And that means that they are, so they're also water stressed, right? So I was just talking to a researcher who's based out of Faisalabad. He's got a paper that will be coming out soon. And one of the things that they found in their work, what it is at the farmer to farmer level, the way what it's called is, it's called Varabandi. Varabandi is a timeshare allocation of water. What that means is it's not a volumetric availability of water. So if you're a farmer who's irrigating 10 acres of land, that doesn't mean that you're guaranteed, a certain amount of water. You are given a certain time of water. And that has a huge problem, because if people upstream have taken more than their share while it's passing through, their land, then by the time it gets to you, the level of the canal, the water in that canal is much smaller than it could be if everybody took exactly their share. So that's why there's an expression where the tails are dry. The tails are dry because there's upstream over abstraction and people downstream are not getting their water shares.
Fascinating.
That's also that third fault line at the level of, between farm to farm.
Perfect. So if we just recap, you would frame the issue as fault lines in terms of the international borders and the river origin and the disputes Pakistan has with its neighbors, then internally between the provinces, and finally at the level of the farmers. Would you like to perhaps, we mentioned earlier that this is an inefficiency issue rather than a supply issue. Before we get into the sort of major inefficiencies in the system, which I think the audience may be somewhat already aware of, would you like to perhaps go into, set a little bit of the historical context as to why we have, and they are agricultural inefficiencies, why they are the way they are today?
I'd be very happy to. I think that's absolutely right. I think understanding this from the base and the historical base is really important. I think the problem is that we have the world's, what is very proudly proclaimed as being the world's largest contiguous irrigation network in the world. And what that means is that it's basically interconnected, right? Now, the British were trying to solve a historical problem. This is a colonial inheritance that we have. This is not something that we made post-partition, which has created its own political economy effects, right? So essentially what the British created, what they were trying to solve was they were trying to spread as much water as there was, because this was at the time without storage, as thinly as possible over land as vast as possible, okay? So now it's about 57, 58 million acres of land that is contiguously irrigated. But what it is that it is deficit irrigation. Deficit irrigation basically means that we are not giving crops as much water as would be optimal, because we have spread available water very, 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 very thinly. We've spread too thin. Now that's creating huge ecological problems also, because as you know, there are very high temperatures in our country. And so there is a very high rate of evaporation. Okay, so Pakistan has a complete ecological environmental catastrophe on its hands, which means that there are tens of millions of tons of salt that are getting deposited on the soil surface, which one will leach into the ground when there is available water. So it'll really destroy aquifer health over time. And plus, because of that evaporation, the soil that remains on the land will reduce crop yields.
So we're caught in a vicious cycle.
Yes, an incredibly old, created vicious cycle. And our response to that is to just somehow miraculously produce more water to somehow keep doing more of what we have been doing for about 150 years.
And just for people who aren't completely familiar, I mean, you touched on it a little bit, and just to overlay a little bit, what is the big problem with canals? Why canals, which, you know, as you've noted, you know, sometimes Pakistanis are taught to be very proud of. We've got the biggest canal system. What is the drawback? Why is this a suboptimal means of irrigating crops?
Okay, so canals are essentially, let's think of them as a 19th century technology, okay, which is what they are, right? The idea is they're gravity fed. So what that means is that the incline is developed in such a way that the water, if it is available somewhere, will flow through gravity and spread over time, okay, through these big sort of, you know, distributions of plots of land. So the idea is it's a 19th century technology. So every time somebody starts saying that, oh, Pakistan should be doing like high efficiency agriculture, right? Or we should be doing modern irrigation. Well, all of that is fine and good. I mean, absolutely, right? So what does that mean? Where you have now, we have lots of technology now, where a lot more of the water is given directly to the plant root zone, so that the plant can just take what it needs, and instead there is no seepage, and there is no evaporation, right? The plant takes up the water that we have applied. Now that can theoretically produce a lot of water or release a lot of water from irrigation. Now, Pakistan is a country, can you imagine, where about 95 to 97% of our available water is given to irrigation. That's incredible. Now, globally, that's about a 70% average, okay? So we're already putting about 25 to 27% more available water towards irrigation than the world is.
Yeah.
Out of that, if we think about what we're doing, we are producing about 5% of our GDP from 95% of the water. Wow. The question to think about on a policy level is, for the country as a whole, is this efficient? Absolutely. Is this what we want to be doing? Is this what we should be doing? Or should we think that, you know, it was an inheritance for its time, it was developed, let's understand it, and let's move forward into the 21st century.
Fascinating. And just to pick you up again once more on a couple of aspects of this. One was the denominator aspect, and obviously I would imagine that the denominator aspect is population growth, which is extremely high. And if you could also go into the exacerbating impact of climate change. Obviously, we're seeing there's within that there are multiple aspects. Obviously, glacial melt is occurring, but that's something which will occur several decades from now is when that will have been depleted. But even right now, we're seeing changes in precipitation patterns and so on. So if you could, sorry, there's many parts to that question. I'm sorry about that. But if you could perhaps start with the population part.
No, I'm absolutely, you're right. Because if you don't think about these as interconnected moving parts, then we're not going to get a handle on what's really happening. So I think that's the right approach. And complexity is a good thing. And we should be able to tackle complexity, okay? And interconnectedness is like, that's how we now understand and study things. Absolutely. Okay. Population, before I ever got into becoming a lawyer and then somebody who really studies the Indus, I worked in Pakistan sort of population sector for about 5 or 6 years. Okay, so I actually know this very, very well, and I know it from the field level up. We have a massive problem, and the massive problem is that changing population behavior patterns is something that takes decades. Okay, Pakistan has been at it for decades, since the 60s at least, and we have only seen incremental changes in population patterns. Okay, so think about now, we have about 220 million people. Okay, by the end of, by half century mark, okay, by 2050, which is 30 years away, it's not that far away. Okay, we're expected to have about 300 million people. And that population is going to rise to about 400 million by the end of the century. And the end of the century is also not that far away, right? It's 80 years away. Think about it. If a child is born today, or if someone's grandchild is born today, it's quite likely that that kid will be alive 80 years from today. Okay? So we're looking at 400 million people on Pakistan's landmass in the next 80 years. That's sort of a doubling. Okay, if it's 220 now and it's getting to 400, that's pretty much about a doubling. Okay, it's pretty serious. So that's happening. And at the same time, now if we come to your sort of question of climate change and what's happening on that front, between 50 to 80% of the water that Pakistan receives annually is either snow melt or glacial melt. Okay.
Wow.
About that. We are a one river system dependent country that is dependent on monsoon and weather patterns being what they are, and the snowpack and the glaciers being stable. And that's where we're hitting a real serious problem. The real serious problem is, and this is literally as new as this year, there used to be a lot more uncertainty, but there are the latest studies on this, and the latest studies are basically saying that, so this mountain range that I said, right, the Himalayan Karakoram Hindu Kush mountain range, okay, it's about 1,200 miles long. And they have now just gone and recently done the most careful study of what's happening to the glaciers in so-called the Western Himalayas and so the eastern side, okay? What we understand is that if global emissions keep rising and temperatures rise according to the best thought scenarios at the moment, okay, essentially about, and this, I'm not being dramatic, about 2/3 of the glaciers will have melted by the turn of the century.
Wow, that's terrifying.
And it should terrify us, right? So we are thinking of a double population with 2/3 of a reduced water resource base.
Is that according to conservative modeling, or who does that model out? Do you know?
No, it's realistic modeling is what I think of it as. The conservative modeling thinks that we lose half of the glaciers. Okay. Now, if I'm somebody who's a realistic person, I think you should be prepared for the worst.
Yeah.
And I think you should get serious. So Pakistan should not prepare for a 50% reduction in glaciers. Pakistan should be prepared for a 2/3 reduction in glaciers, right? Once you let these climate effects churn in the atmosphere, and these are the best sort of assumptive models, right? That's what models can do.
Sure.
So what happens in real behavior? I mean, it could be a little better, but it could be a little worse also. Right?
So sorry to interrupt you there, but from what we were chatting about yesterday before this talk, did you mention that this is what we're, in terms of the modeling for the glaciers, this is stuff which is already locked in because of the greenhouse gases now in the atmosphere, as opposed to this is reversible, we can save it? What was it? Yeah.
At least for the next 30 years, so the mid-century mark, it's pretty much locked in. right? I mean, you saw what was happening, even with, where now because of Corona, there were all these lockdowns, right? So there was these studies of how global emissions went down. Well, global emissions only went down where the sort of the world in different phases and, in space was sitting at home, as it were, right? So global emissions only went down by about 5%. So you would have thought they would have gone down by a lot more, right? But the churn effects in the atmosphere keep happening. And Pakistan's real problem is that we do not at the moment have another economic model. Okay. About 65% of the country's population is dependent on some kind of an agricultural income, very low value agricultural income. And what gets totally ignored when we talk about Pakistan's irrigation network is the amount of people employed in livestock. Okay, a lot of people have basically work on very low value productive dairy agriculture. Okay, and that's about 35 million people. This is the government of Pakistan's own figures. So very low productive value agriculture of both dairy and sort of what is thought of as more traditional agriculture is what employs people. So the question really should be, right, of, well, how are we going to transition out of this low value model in the next 80 years, because these changes are happening. These are not some things that are going to change. They may change a little, but for the most part, these things are going to occur.
And right now, I mean, again, something that we discussed earlier, that instead of looking at fundamentally sort of retooling the economy, the solution seems to be from the top, seems to be just one idea, and that idea is dams. Could you maybe discuss your views on that? Are there any positives? Are there what are the negatives? And why? How suitable an idea you think it is, and to what extent how suitable it is?
Okay, I'm happy to address that. So look, the fact of the matter is, as I said, Pakistan is downstream of India, right? And there is a constant tension around the operation of the Indus Waters Treaty that was signed in 1960, okay? Essentially, what we have is that we are stuck in a hardware mode. And that I mean with policy making and decision making within Pakistan. It's stuck in a hardware mode. And what it is it's sort of like this infrastructure romanticism, which goes back about half a century, okay? And I think that that is now completely out of date. Even if we add a certain number of dams, how much water will we be able to store in within that year and within multi-year dam storage, as other countries also try to think of creating, right? So you store enough that it'll, tide you over lows and highs, right?
Sure.
The dam may be able to smooth out the curve a little bit. So we essentially have two cropping seasons. We have Kharif and Rabi. Rabi is like the winter. So after, because the winter has happened, the snow has not melted. So that's when it's like difficult and water is short. So it's only when snow melt happens that more water comes, right? Okay. But what I'm saying now is that, look, the snowpacks are disappearing. Yeah. Okay. So over the next 80 years, a lot of this reliance on this particular model of catching snow melt is going to be irrelevant, because there will be no more water to catch or to put in it. So a dam may temporarily do something,
yeah,
but they are very, very expensive to produce and to make and to operate. They take decades. They will take time to fill up. And meanwhile, what ends up happening, and this is something I know from my work very closely, if you give the bureaucracy a certain task, the bureaucracy starts moving in that direction. Okay, so the focus, the top of mind focus is, let's get this dam made. And that can take decades of fighting and infighting. Okay, and that's a huge, huge problem, because what that means is that the things that should be happening, the things that we need to be doing, meanwhile, are not done. So to give one example, this latest Diamir Bhasha Dam that has now only the dam component has been approved. Okay. Yep. Meanwhile, the power generation component has not been yet given a go ahead. Okay. So just the dam component may cost, say, $3 to $4 billion. okay? And it'll take time to build. Now, the entire project is supposed to cost about 14 to 16 billion dollars, okay? So it's a difficult thing to fund and to process. But if that is made, say it's $4 billion and say it's a certain amount of time, okay? There is displacement, there are all kinds of ecological impacts that happen because of dams, there are valleys that are submerged, there's all kinds of problems that happen with dams, plus downstream water sort of that goes into, say, the delta, the Arabian Sea's delta will be further reduced, right? Okay, so there's all kinds of problems that happen with dams. They take decades to build in all, because we've been planning on making this dam for several decades already. Okay? We are stuck in an infrastructure sort of romanticism. And to give you one example, I have a chapter coming out in a book about sort of historians of the Cold War. If you go back and look very, very closely at what happened at the time of signing the Indus Waters Treaty, was where the world was different. There were these two camps. There was a US camp and there was USSR. And the US wanted to tie countries in Asia in particular, which is what I'm focusing on, to itself, okay? So there was a lot of involvement from the US side in making sure that the World Bank came along, and the treaty eventually was agreed, which took a decade of work, okay? People sat in Washington, DC for a decade and tried to hash this out. So that took a decade of work during the Cold War era. That kind of global interest in Pakistan's geostrategic water vulnerabilities essentially no longer exists.
Are you talking about the India-Pakistan Treaty? Sorry, which took a decade.
The Indus Waters Treaty between India and Pakistan that was signed in 1960, exactly. Which the US and the World Bank had a huge hand in getting agreed.
Yeah.
So basically, no one in terms of a global sort of scale is interested in Pakistan's water problems anymore to that extent.
So the globally, they don't have Pakistan's back anymore in a sense, because those situations, those scenarios don't exist. But do you see any sort of utility in dams given the extremely, at this point, hostile India and the threats over the explicit threats to choke the supply?
So okay, so let's tackle this very, very, very precisely. Look, what happens in Kashmir really matters to Pakistan. Okay, geostrategically, it always has. What we could and we should have done several decades doing is handling that very, very differently than we did. Okay, so in 1975, this is like a factoid, I'm putting it out there, India made something which is called the National Hydroelectric Power Corporation, okay, NHPH, okay? And what that did from then onwards into the 80s and 90s and subsequently, okay? Absolutely. So while Pakistan was essentially, as sort of Kashmir was an extant government, right? It was an actual state within the Federation of India. And that was something that could have been a check on Indian government policy as they tried to be for decades, okay? So this India-Pakistan Water Treaty basically leaves out the Kashmiris, okay? And it always did. So the Kashmiris were never supposed to really be able to use the water that was flowing through their territory, and India was supposed to let it flow down to Pakistan. So the Kashmiris have always felt entirely shafted by this treaty because they said, well, we're also a stakeholder. What they were fighting and what they were trying to stand for, even within India, was that this, their power corporation was developing power projects in Kashmir because that's where they're best physically situated, and taking the power and the electricity to other parts of India, right? And without giving them enough sort of, royalties and all those kinds of things, okay? So the Kashmiris were trying to resist that. Now, obviously, we understand from last year with their change where they've made both Kashmir and Ladakh, right, union territories, right? Yep. They still have about now, without the check of an actual state government in Kashmir, trying to hold the Indian Federation accountable for the use of its resources, they still have now about, therefore, so now they are unchecked in a way, and they have about a dozen projects planned. that are big hydropower and hydroelectric power sort of projects that they will develop in Kashmir. Okay, now without a Kashmiri check, as it were, as if ineffective as it could have been. The point is, Pakistan could have spent several decades highlighting the sort of the resource theft, as it were, or the resource claim that the Federation of India was making on Kashmiri resources, right? So we could have stood and made a very honorable point in front of the world and said, this is not about, our water as such. This is even that the territory that it's flowing through is not getting its due share. So we didn't do that for several decades. Now this is something that is unchecked, and now that they can do it. Now I understand we've issued a new map, right, which is like sort of a political map, but a political map doesn't create a reality on the ground. And that reality on the ground is that they are still sitting there, right? And they have all these power projects planned, and they will now make them unchecked. For the last couple of years, to just come back to the World Bank example, right? The last couple of years, essentially the threat has been where India and Pakistan sort of negotiating a dispute resolution on the treaty itself has really reached sort of these strange breakdown points. Okay, the World Bank just came on one specific dispute after 2 years of pausing the process and said to both countries that it cannot intervene. So the two countries now bilaterally have to agree how they intend moving forward on this particular dispute. And then they can tell the World Bank, and then the World Bank will proceed onward from that point in time. So Pakistan is very vulnerable, but now doesn't even have a lot of those international support networks that it could once rely on and call upon.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, our policy process is still, I think it's rigidified into like a mindset that is romantic about the world that used to be, instead of realizing that that world does not exist. Meanwhile, this other very dramatically changed world will come about in 80 years, which is no time at all for the life of a nation.
Yeah.
And how do we prepare for that?
So yeah, that's what I want to get onto now. I guess like this is sort of filling me with quite a lot of gloom at this point. So what we talk about the way that we need to sort of retool the economy and use these water resources more efficiently, and perhaps not use them in certain sectors, and rethink, just because it has always been so, it should not. What are the obstacles preventing that from happening? And A, on the domestic front, and B, on the foreign front, what can be done now? Obviously, there was many steps that could have been taken in previous decades, which were not, but we're in a situation now. So what are your views on those two things?
Okay, I think absolutely it can become like, when you study this thing sort of like very, very closely, it can start to look really like, oh my God, this is this massive 150-year-old system with its own political economy effects, and how do we move out of there? So I think that's a good pivot. So thanks a lot for, let's try and focus us on how do we move forward. So one of the things that I think we really need to understand is that the institutions and laws that we have for managing our water currently are built on these old paradigms, and they're not built on where we need to be headed. So I think what Pakistan needs to do very seriously is actually to create it's like a moonshot, okay? Create a moonshot for itself and say, look, we are facing a doubling of population and say at a conservative level, a halving of resources, right? And now what is it that we do going forward, okay? Okay, so how do we set this moonshot? One of the things that we have to do is that we have to get out of the institutional fix that we are in. There's been very good work done sort of around the world on essentially how it is basically your institutions and your bureaucracies that fixate you within a particular kind of paradigm. I'll give you one example. This is from the US. The US is a massive, huge country. And essentially it has like this 100th meridian that divides the east and the west of the country. The East is relatively hydrologically sort of wet, the West is relatively hydrologically dry. And what that would suggest is that we would do irrigated agriculture, or we would do agriculture in the East where maybe less big projects of irrigation were needed, right? Okay, wonderful. But yet, essentially, large agriculture in the United States is stuck or is situated in the West, which is dry. So there are massive water appropriations that have to happen, massive projects, etc. Okay, now that's
fascinating. It's not just Pakistan which gets stuck in old paradigms. This is a global phenomenon. It's something that
yes, exactly. It's a global phenomenon. It's a serious problem. Okay. So what we have done is, so instead of, I think one of the things that Pakistan seriously needs to do is, instead of getting fixated, right? Somebody like me who studies this, who teaches this, who thinks about this, right? One of the things that we do is that what we start doing is, and we are very, very good at this, and you know this in sector after sector, right? Is that we brand anybody who thinks that they are, or is suggesting something other than the norm that is sort of like accepted, as somebody who is somehow less faithful to the nation, right? So we're very good at branding. And I think we have to move beyond that very simplistic.
So the people who are questioning dams are traitors and so on, that kind of thing.
That kind of thing, right? And anybody who is saying, well, it's reducing water, or it's reducing water to the delta, I mean, is somehow making stuff up, right? Or is somehow...
And beyond that, as we said, like taking away the silt, the good quality, as you talked about downstream, and filling up, as you talked about, they fill up over time and so on, and their capacity reduces markedly very quickly.
Exactly, because we've got a silt load, so we're trapping silt behind the dam. So there's obviously all kinds of ecological devastation. Plus, less is coming down, which is nutrient rich, essentially, right? So human beings have lived in these sort of like mountain range, the foothills of these mountain ranges and the deltas and the plains, right, for thousands of years, okay, and done flood irrigation. So it's not that we don't have nutrients coming down these mountains, right? We do. Okay. So what Pakistan basically needs to do is move out and beyond its its agency and its institutional fix, right? The nation needs to really seriously realize that, look, we have a problem and our current institutions are not going to solve them for us. Now, that doesn't mean that you throw out everything and you start again, right? What that means is you bring people along, you give them a vision that says, look, we can move, we have to move in this direction. Pakistan could be, to be hopeful about this, and I mean this very, very sincerely, because we have a massive endowment. At least in the modern era, we have about 150, 160 years of managing this massive river system, okay? So we have skills and knowledge. What we don't do is that we do not trust our people. We do not tap the best creativities of our people, okay? And I think that's a huge first problem. If you go talk to farmers at, say, the tails, one of the things that they will always tell you is that, look, we never know how much water is coming. We don't know how much water is coming, right? This is a key input. A key input. Imagine you have to run a business and you don't know what the status or situation is of a key input. Okay, how well are you going to do? What are the decisions you'll be able to make? Okay, so key things like that we don't do. We do not support our farmers in serious ways. Plus, we have massive other degradation that is also happening. So there's now very good understanding that there could be about 60 million people in Pakistan who are drinking polluted water, which is basically arsenic poisoned. So arsenic poisoning is a real thing. Okay, this is having effects on kidneys and gallbladders, and there's all kinds of effects of polluted water that people are having. Okay, the groundwater table in Lahore, for instance, is falling. Okay, and it's falling around the country. In Quetta, it's reaching very seriously drastic levels. And in Quetta, it's a closed aquifer. It's not replenishable, okay, because it's hard. So what are we going to do with the 8 million people, for instance, who live in Quetta, okay, if there's no water to be had there? So Pakistan has a huge set of problems that are not going to be solved by making one or two or even a dozen pieces of hardware that will somehow add more water, because in any case, we've said that that water is depleting.
So concretely speaking, what do you sort of envisage? I know that you obviously don't have all the answers, but if you, just as a guideline, I will just, and we have a question and I'll get to that in just a moment, but are you suggesting sort of pivoting away from the agricultural economy, or doing it smarter and finding ways to kind of minimize water wastage, or both?
I think both, as well as a third that you said, right, which is minimizing water wastage. Okay. We also understand now that about 60% of water that we divert into canals is wasted, or is not. What that means is that it is not taken up by the plant. Okay. Some of it goes to replenish the groundwater, but we are polluting those groundwater aquifers also. So they are not as usable as they would otherwise be, right? If you go talk to farmers, one of the things that they tell you is that a lot of farmers that are in the sweet water zones that can actually put a tube well in and actually use groundwater are mixing groundwater with canal water, because groundwater is not of adequate quality, in that it's too salty and it's too polluted. So they need to sort of balance it out and mix it with canal water. Okay. So we're really polluting the land on which we are sitting. So we need to do that less, obviously, but we need to divert less towards agriculture. We need to give it towards domestic consumer industrial purposes. Those are going to be the economies of the future. To give you one quick example, if we can just fold it in, the Colorado River system in the US essentially uses, which is about 40 million people who rely on that river system, okay, uses about 15 million acre feet of water a year. And they are a very rich part of the world, okay, despite all of these wildfires in California. By contrast, Pakistan has about 150 to 165 million acre feet of surface and groundwater use every year.
How many more times?
Well, think about it. So 15 to about 150.
Okay.
Right? It's massive.
About 10 times more.
Right? About 10 times more water we are using annually, and then complaining that we don't have enough and we want to somehow add more. It's a mismanagement, misgovernance. If you go and look at all of the scales of the institutions that are working, they're not working in the right direction, because they don't have a right sort of, a path, right? A right sort of goal that, look, this is where we need to head. And I really think that we need to move away from being behind high informational barriers, where all of this information is sort of like behind these national security sort of, high barricades, where, by the way, it does get out. Like this latest research on glaciers, scientists have now worked on declassified information, like spy satellite pictures, to look at what glaciers look like, say, at the turn of the century, or in the 1970s. And then onwards, now, obviously, we have current satellite images, right? So therefore, it gets out somehow. It doesn't matter whether you try and put it behind high information barriers. So I actually think that Pakistan could be water surplus. We could meet our agricultural as well as our human development needs. I mean, 40% of Pakistan is hungry. There is massive malnourishment. This is about sub-Saharan African levels. How is it that you can have the world's largest contiguous irrigation network, which is supposed to give you security, and yet have so much hunger and malnourishment and childhood stunting and female anemia?
Absolutely. I'm just going to pivot to a question right now. So how essential is the tree campaign kickstarted by PM Imran Khan going to go for maintaining glaciers intact in the bigger picture? Is it enough? I have thoughts on that, but I'll let you start first.
So I actually think that, I mean, who can be against like greening, right? Okay, but they've done very good work on how other campaigns around the world have worked. And the results are marginal to marginally disappointing. This is a fact, because it doesn't grow in times. It's also a lot of times it's not letting rich ecosystems, like say the Amazon rainforest that is not touched, okay, has a natural ecosystem, has thousands of types of plants that have developed. And those have a much bigger protective value than a place where you go and try, put one type of tree, over a big portion of land, right? So a natural ecosystem has not developed. Meanwhile, Pakistan has totally destroyed and is continuing to destroy its wetlands. What happened in the 2010 floods? There was massive flooding because once a river does flood, it wants to go where it used to historically go. It has a memory. The land has a memory of where the water used to come, okay?
Yep.
So water will spread where it has historically always spread, despite what you want to do to channelize it. In China, that's what they're finding this year. The Yangtze is in massive flood. The Three Gorges Dam basically is not able to hold back the flood that has come, and they have to let it go through. So all of the spillways in China are now open. So with tree campaigns, where the Chinese have also done to hold back the Gobi Desert, okay, in sort of Mongolia, it's very marginal. Plus, Pakistan has another problem. The other problem is that between 40 to 50% of the watershed of the rivers of the Indus River system is not within Pakistan's territorial control. So that means that what India now will do in Kashmir in those watersheds is obviously going to impact, the water and the water quality that we get down in Pakistan. Okay. So it's never bad, but oh my God, there's so much more that we are not able to do. So within the contiguous sort of territory of Pakistan, we need to seriously be working on the things that we can solve, which is actually going towards like change people's attitudes, that you're not going to get security because if we make a dam or not, that's not what's going to happen. You fundamentally have to change your attitude. We have this problem coming, and that means that we need to basically innovate in our institutions, innovate in our technologies, and really trust the people. And so as a result, change laws and institutions and governance. And I think we can be water secure, we can be food productive, in that we can actually give a good nutritive quality diet to our people, not just enough in caloric terms, right? Because obviously nutrient quality also matters. Meanwhile, we've left too many people too poor to be able to afford a nutritious diet. So we need to be asking these very, very hard questions from this massive system that we have and say, look, it's not fit for purpose for the 21st century, and we need to get serious. And I don't see that, but essentially, if I had a magic wand, that's where I would get everybody headed, in this century.
That's a really good way to wrap it up as well. I just want to go back to the question. I also cover the environment. It's a good question. I understand people might be thinking this. It's a laudable goal to plant trees, and for many, many reasons. But the planetary warming, which is melting the glaciers, isn't really because of the gas emission, isn't something which Pakistan is really inputting a significant amount into. It's other countries. And if other countries were to sort of meet their goals under the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and we were to sort of to keep the greenhouse gas emissions down to a point where the planet doesn't warm by more than 1.5 degrees by the end of the century, I don't know where that will leave the glaciers. As for the models which Dr. Sattar is citing, it seems that a lot of it's already locked in and the glaciers are going to be melting anyway. And plus, I'm not that optimistic about the Paris goals themselves being met, very sadly, very unfortunately. So while it's a great thing to do, we should be planting trees, that is not going to save the glaciers. Unfortunately, that's not what's going to happen. And so we have to really be looking at ways to mitigate. And yes, it is a global issue. It doesn't know borders. It's not that if Pakistan takes care of things really, really, really well in its borders, that's going to be enough. It's very sadly, it's not going to be enough. Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. Thank you so much. Right. So even if this is kept up, because so many of basically the Paris commitments are voluntary. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And the transition will take a very, very long time. So these things are locked in. And now good research is telling us that it's going to be about 4.5 degree rise. Okay. That's the realistic scenario, that it's very unlikely that we will meet 1.5. So it'll be definitely more than 1.5, which really threatens this. Meanwhile, we're the only ones responsible for our territories and what happens in it, right? So obviously these are global forces. Maybe we didn't create the problems, but we certainly have this massive irrigation system that we have the ability to run. So my vision for Pakistan is that we really become a knowledge leader, okay, in how to demonstrate to the world that how do you live on a depleted resource base, and yet how do you have a thriving economy and population. It is absolutely possible, because that is the world we're going to have to inherit. There are no choices there, and it'll be much smarter, the quicker we get with the program, as it were, and say, okay, this is now the future. We've learned our lessons. Let's head in this direction.
It's a very hopeful vision, and I hope that it's something that we can embrace and to start get serious about. I think that's a good note to leave it. So thanks for LLF for having us and hosting this and important discussion. And I enjoyed speaking with you and sharing it with everyone else.
Thank you very much, Issam. Thank you. This is wonderful. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, everyone out there.